Your Majesty, Your Royal Highnesses, Your Holiness, Your Eminences, Your Graces, my Lords, Ladies, représentatifs et représentatives distingués du corps diplomatique international, and Uncle Tom Cobley and all, here at the COP26 conference, you should be thoroughly ashamed of yourselves. Because if you are honest, Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. President, Sir David Attenborough, or Boaty McBoatface, as I suppose we should really call you, you know perfectly well that you lack either the scientific or the statistical or the control theoretic or the economic knowledge or understanding. You lack the grasp of the scientific method and of the language of science, that is mathematics, to be able to make any pronouncement whatsoever on whether or not global warming is a global crisis, on whether or not we are at 1 minute to or 1 minute past midnight. All of this sloganizing and platitude producing is shameful, because essentially every time you pronounce Your Royal Highness that you've been saying for years that it's going to be a terrible crisis, the fact is you lack either the intellect or the ability to be dispassionate so that you can give a credible assessment. And in any case, Your Royal Highness, now listen to this, you need to pay attention for once, because I have warned you privately, and I now warn you publicly, that it is the one constitutional obligation of a future constitutional monarch to remain absolutely silent on all matters of politics. And you may think, as Dr. Wilkerson has pointed out, that there is such a consensus on all sides, that therefore that somehow takes it out of politics. Well, let me remind you, for you perhaps have not read any history for some time, of the 1920s and 30s, 100 years ago, when all the major parties represented in Parliament, in fact 425 of the 450 members of Parliament then sitting, were in favour of appeasing Hitler's Germany. And they were wrong to do so. So you cannot say that just because there appears to be an albeit manufactured political consensus about global warming, that therefore you are safe in pronouncing on this matter. If, sir, you wish to be king, then henceforth and for aye, be silent on all political matters, or you will have to resign the throne for yourself and for your heirs and successors forthwith and for all time. We are not prepared to accept a constitutional monarch who does not obey the necessary constraints upon a constitutional monarch. Be silent, sir, or go, sir. With that preface, let me now explain why it is that in fact there is no crisis, there is no emergency. You might start by saying that if the best that this conference can do to produce the imagined emergency and to justify it is to go to children of the Balilla, of the Hitler Youth, of the babes and sucklings to tell us the science of global warming. Well, come off it. The working people of Britain and of the other countries of the West against whom this policy of shutting down our economies in the specious name of saving the planet, the working people are fed up to the back teeth with all of this drivel. And the only reason why the trade unions have not spoken out as they should have done on behalf of the interests of their workers is because they have for decades been fatally compromised by their close association with the very communist powers from whom this global nonsense sprang and by whom it is fostered and festered by large amounts of money and influence. So it is time then to take a more objective, a more dispassionate look at whether or not there is a climate emergency. And in order to do this, we are going to look at a series of errors perpetrated by those peddling this nonsense, errors so obvious that I shall be able to explain them even to you, the delegates at COP26, compromised though you are by your lack of knowledge of anything to do with climate science or any form of science or mathematics. Because the points I'm going to put to you are elementary. I shall be largely using the official consensus data, and I shall be drawing strikingly obvious and undeniably correct conclusions. Let us begin with the first and most obvious question that anyone who was dispassionately examining the question of global warming would ask. What is the ideal global mean surface temperature? Now, you have been listening for 10, 20, 30, getting on for 40 years, some of you, to all this bleating and blethering and blathering by the foo and the frit in these conferences about global warming. So, you must, after your 10, 20, 30, 40 years of watching this storyline develop, for it is certainly not scientific, it is just a fictional storyline, you will be able to tell me what the ideal global mean surface temperature is. You'll be able to tell me what the current global mean surface temperature is. You'll be able to tell me what the difference between these two is, how much more global warming we can have before we have any kind of a crisis. Or maybe you can't, because you've never actually bothered to ask the question. And it's a very straightforward question. What is the ideal global mean surface temperature? In case some of you, Sir David Attenborough, don't understand why that question is an important question, let me explain it to you in very short words that you may be able to get. The answer is this. If you don't know what the ideal global mean surface temperature is, you cannot say that the warming compared with today would be a bad thing. Suppose, as we shall see in one or two scientific papers as I go through this presentation, that the ideal global mean surface temperature for all life on this planet is approximately 5 Celsius degrees above today's temperature. Well, in that case, the more global warming we can get, the more coal, oil and gas we can burn to push up the temperature, the better. Far from it being an emergency, it becomes a necessity to burn the coal, oil and gas to generate the electricity so as to approach more closely the ideal temperature. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the ideal temperature is, because if by now you haven't bothered to ask, you probably won't be very interested in my answer or in any answer to that question. But to those who are more dispassionate and more alarmed at the way the Western economies uniquely and selectively and only, are trashing themselves and committing economic harakiri in the specious name of saving the planet, then you should at least find it curious that the question, what is the ideal global mean surface temperature, has never been asked by any of those posturing numpties at COP26. They haven't asked it because to ask that or any question, however elementary, however obviously the sort of question that one should ask, is to depart from the climate communist party line. Now, when I use the phrase climate communist, I don't mean that every stupid climate campaigner gluing herself to the road and stopping ambulances getting their patients to hospital is a communist. What I am saying is that there is a very large element of totalitarian input into this climate nonsense, and totalitarians of every kind. It doesn't matter whether they're Islamist, it doesn't matter whether they're communist, it doesn't matter whether they're fascist. They do not wish us well because they do not like the great freedoms on which the West is constructed. The freedom of election, the freedom of religion, the freedom of scientific endeavor and inquiry and publication, and the freedom of speech, and the freedom of market. Liberty, that is what is at the root of Western civilization. And this whole climate nonsense is designed to bring that liberty sharply, expensively, painfully, and, as I shall show, murderously, to an end. Now they will then say, oh, but there's a consensus. And whenever they say it, it always comes out like that. There's a consensus. Well, no, as it happens, there isn't a consensus. And even if there were, if you had been properly educated, then you would know that science isn't done by consensus anyway. So let us look at where this idea of consensus came from. Now, the use of the word consensus is a hallmark of far left, or basically of communist agitation. They try to say, there is a party line, everybody's agreed on it, you must comply. If you don't comply, then our agents at Fastbook and YouTube and Google and all those tech giants will make sure that you don't get your views aired. Well, the idea of consensus about the climate came from a paper published by a group of communists, and I use the word communists advisedly because the Strategic Threat Assessment Group was able to get into the intranet that the authors of that paper of 2013 in Australia were communicating with each other. And we found that they were saying, tee-hee, if we can invent a consensus and get a paper published in an agreeable communist front scientific journal, then the politicians in the West will believe that there really is a problem with the climate. And this is our way of helping towards the destruction of the West. And I confronted the ghastly Mr. Cook with this last time I saw him. And he was very upset that we'd been able to hack in and see that these were a group of left-wingers trying to undermine Western civilization by what is, frankly, and I'm going to use the word bluntly, a lie. Now, let me tell you how they did this lie. They published a paper saying that they had read 11,944 papers on climate and related topics, published after peer review in the leading journals of climate and related subjects over the 21 years 1991 to 2011. And they reported that in the abstracts or summaries at the beginning of each of those papers, 97.1% of those papers had explicitly stated the consensus view as Cook and his communist friends had defined it, namely that global warming is chiefly man-made. Now, in fact, when they had had 3 weeks of massive international publicity in the various Marx stream media, I was eventually able to persuade them to let me have their list of all 11,944 papers, and I wrote a computer program to read it down and count how many of those papers they had themselves marked as explicitly stating that global warming was chiefly man-made over recent decades. And the answer, when the computer spat it out, was 64. Not 640, not 6,400, not 64,000 out of 11,944. No, 64 papers they had themselves marked as saying that the global warming is chiefly man-made. When we read those papers, we found that only 41 of the 64 had actually stated what Cook et al. Had said they had stated. So the true figure for this much vaunted consensus on the basis of which, Prime Minister, you gibber futilely about 1 minute to midnight, is actually a 0.3% consensus, which was fraudulently, and I use that word advisedly for a reason I'm going to explain in a moment, presented, or rather misrepresented, in that paper as 97.1%. Now, you have to be pretty intellectually challenged if you cannot understand that 0.3%, the true consensus, is not the same as 97.1%, the consensus that was reported. How do I know that this was fraudulent? Because a citizen of Queensland, having heard that there was this disparity, perhaps the largest in the history of science, between what had actually been found by the researchers and what they had reported, he tried complaining to their university and got nowhere, because the universities are also largely in the hands of communists now. So he went to the Queensland police with a witness statement setting out the facts I've just given you. And he said, I am making an official complaint that this paper was fraudulent, and it has inflicted upon Australian and other taxpayers and users of energy worldwide enormous financial damage by what is essentially a lie and a deception and a fraud. And the Queensland police investigated, and they found that a deception had indeed occurred, but there was then a socialist government in Australia, and it forbade the police to do anything more about it. So that is what we're up against, open manipulation of data. And all I did was to get a computer to read down the comma delimited file and add up the figures as I've just given them to you. Well, then, of course, you may have heard of another communist journalist, this time from our communist daily newspaper, The Guardian. And again, I use the word communist advisedly because The Guardian is a communist newspaper. Get over it. And Mr. Linus has produced another paper carrying forward the work of Cook et al. From 2011 until the present, reading a whole lot of other papers and saying the consensus that global warming is man-made, or chiefly man-made, is now 99.9%. Well, here's the thing. We have no idea how much global warming is attributable to us and how much to natural processes. We cannot say for certain that it is mostly down to us. We can say some of it probably, possibly is. That is as far as any true and legitimate scientist would presume to go. But of course, there's also a bait and switch behind all this, because what these papers didn't do was to ask the scientists, do your papers say that this global warming is going to be dangerous? because then you'd have found an even smaller percentage than 0.3%, because it isn't dangerous, as you have already seen. The deaths from adverse weather have been falling for a century. So the one thing we know is that warmer weather isn't a bad idea. But they pretend that we caused most of it when they know perfectly well we can't say that for certain. And then they pretend that it's dangerous when the figures by the all-accred international database of weather-related disasters do not bear out that opinion. But in any event, argument from consensus is an unholy conflation of two of the ancient fallacies of logic, first listed and excoriated by Aristotle 2,400 years ago, Your Majesty. Just because you're told by your ministers that everyone who matters is agreed on this subject doesn't mean that they are, and even if they were, they could simply be wrong. Argument from mere headcount, Mr. Linus, Mr. Cook, is a fallacy of logic. And argument from appeal to the imagined authority of supposed experts is also a fallacy of logic. And the only correct conclusion that one may legitimately draw from a fallacy of logic, particularly from two fallacies of logic rolled into one, is that those perpetrating these fallacies are either insufficiently educated to realize how monumentally stupid they make themselves look, or too politically committed to care either way. Next error, they've been telling us global warming is going to be 11 Celsius this century. Margaret Thatcher herself, in a speech written not by me but by my successor as a scientific advisor at 10 Downing Street, said that temperature would rise by 1 Celsius per decade. Well, it hasn't, of course. The Stern report of 2006 said there would be 11 Celsius of warming, and on that basis there was a 20% chance of the entire planet coming to an end by 2100. I'm sorry, a 10% chance. Well, of course, the planet may come to an end by 2100, but the idea that a trivial change in the composition of the atmosphere, leading to a still more trivial change in the temperature of the atmosphere, will bring the planet to an end by 2100 is drivelling nonsense. Yet it is that drivelling nonsense that underpins the British government's understanding of why we must bankrupt the British economy, throw British working people out of jobs for the sake of saving the planet. CO2 has been rising at a rate faster than the business as usual scenario in IPCC's first assessment report in 1990. Now, the business as usual graph there, that's A, the top line, heading off up to the top right there, that is the line that they predicted if there were no efforts made to abate CO2 emissions. Sure enough, we're above that line. So when we come to the temperature graphs that I shall now show, they can't say that the temperature hasn't been rising fast because we've been reining in our CO2 emissions, because we haven't. That hasn't stopped some of the climate communists from pretending that that's why the global warming that they had so confidently predicted hasn't occurred. How much then did they predict? Well, none of you here at COP26 can answer that one, because you know what the party line is, but you don't know why, and you don't know the science, and you haven't bothered to find out. Now, let me explain one thing. In the law of the United Kingdom, if you make a statement knowing that that statement is false, and you do so either to profit yourself or to cause loss to others, then you commit a fraud. It is a lie for profit or for causing loss. But you are equally guilty of fraud in the law of the United Kingdom if you say that you know something to be true when, and let us be honest, delegates at COP26, most of you, in fact nearly all of you, haven't the faintest idea whether what you are saying about the supposed climate emergency is true. You know that it is fashionable. You know that if you don't toe the party line, you can't get in. Those corporations and individuals who wanted to go and put the other point of view were told by the UN that they would not be welcome, because the UN is not a democratic organization. Like all the other supranational, international organizations, it is unelected, and every time power is transferred from elected hands here to unelected hands somewhere else, democracy dies a little. And on this subject of the climate, democracy is dying a lot. And it may not survive unless we, the people, stand up against you, the governing class, because you are guilty of a trahison d'éclair, a treason by the governing class against and a betrayal of the working people who depend upon you for wise counsel and sensible decisions, rather than the peddling of a comfortable but wildly erroneous party line. So IPCC predicted 0.34 Celsius per decade equivalent between 1990 and 2030. We're 3/4 of the way through that. So let's see how we're getting on, shall we? It's actually 0.14 Celsius per decade, not 0.34. It's 60% less than what they confidently predicted in IPCC 1990. And in case you want to quibble about whether they predicted or projected, the word they used was predicted. Get over it. And the observed warming since 1945, since the end of the Second World War, 0.11 Celsius per decade. There it is. All you have to do is plot the data. And that's less than 1/3 of what they had confidently predicted as their mid-range estimate. And here we can see why. Because there are very, very long periods without any global warming, punctuated by occasional sudden spikes in global warming. That's not what we would expect as the pattern if CO2 was the reason for it. What has happened is that as the sun is pulled around the gravitational barycenter of the solar system by the orbital characteristics of the gas giant planets, Jupiter and Saturn, the crustal deformation beneath the ocean that is caused by those variations opens up so that the magma can come from below. And in the mid-ocean divergence zones where this occurs, the most prominent of them is in the tropical eastern Pacific, in what is known as the Niño 1 and 2 region. Beneath that region, not one but 3 of these ridges meet at a point where the divergence between the tectonic plates is occurring at a rate, an order of magnitude, and that, Your Royal Highness, means 10 times the global average for such divergences in mid-ocean, allowing magmatic intrusion from below. And if you've been watching the volcanoes recently in Iceland or in Italy or in La Palma, you will see that when that magma comes up, it's very hot. And if it comes up under the ocean, it heats up the ocean. The warmth is then carried around the world. And Professor Arthur Vittorito has written a distinguished series of papers pointing out the links between these orbital characteristics and the behavior of the crust and the emergence of warming from below, which is then circulated around the oceans by the thermohaline circulation, of which our end is the Gulf Stream that comes up here in western Scotland and gives it a climate far milder than the English Midlands. Now, one fact that you delegates here at COP26 have somehow failed to discuss or mention is that according to the British temperature record, the longest standing of all of them, there has been no global warming at all for 7 years and 7 months. And so there's a very simple question that arises from that fact, a fact which has been widely unreported in the mainstream media. How can they say it's worse than we thought when it's so much less than they predicted? How can they say there's an emergency and we're 1 minute to midnight when for the last 7 years and 7 months there has been not a flicker of global warming at all? The trend is a flat zero for all that time, practically since the last IPCC report. Then, of course, you hear a lot about extreme weather and people dying all over the world because of that extreme weather. So let's have a look, not at the rhetoric, but at the scientific facts. For it is my job to give you these scientific facts. Now, first of all, I'm grateful to Roger Pielike Jr. And you notice I'm quoting a lot of scientists here. These are scientists who are doing very good independent work on the climate. They are accredited, skilled, proper scientists, professors and doctors of science. And they have come to conclusions at odds with the party line. And you're told no serious scientist dares to question the official consensus on the climate. Well, yes, they do. And I shall be quoting quite a few of them during this presentation. Here I quote very distinguished scientist, Dr. Roger Pielike Jr. He and his father have done very good work on this. And Roger Pielike Jr. actually says maybe climate change caused by us could be a problem, but let's not get it out of perspective. So he had a very good look at the IPCC report of 2021. And there is a question in science known as detection and attribution. Detection means you find that extreme weather is happening to a degree that you hadn't previously expected or experienced. And attribution means you think that it was caused by a given phenomenon, such as anthropogenic global warming. Now, the IPCC reviewed in detail 54 of these attribution and detection studies. Roger Pielike Jr. went forward and looked them up and tabulated them. And of those 54, 53 said there was no detection or attribution of any climatic event that could in any way be attributed to us or our warming of their planet. Only one of those studies said that some of the weather phenomena we have seen may have been attributable to us. And that was Grinsted et al. 2019. And upon that sole study, contradicted by 53 others reviewed by the IPCC has based its false and deliberately mendacious assertion that it was we who caused the extreme weather events that you see around the world. Extreme weather events which, if you knew any history, you would realize have been happening in the last 4.5 billion years. There's nothing unprecedented about the rate, the frequency, the type, or the incidence of any of these events. It's all happened before. But let us have a look at the IPCC's analysis. Again, I'm grateful to Dr. Pielike for this, because he gave a very good lecture to the Climate Intelligence Group, of which I have the honour to be a member. And in that lecture, he presented a table that you now see. Grinsted et al. Said that there were only 4 events that you could attribute to us that have been happening more frequently. Heat waves, weather causing forest fires, severe droughts, and heavy rain. Now, of course, anyone with half a brain would at once say, wouldn't they, fellow delegates at COP26, wouldn't they, Your Majesty? They'd say, but hang on a moment. How can they say that droughts and rain are both attributable to us? Because they're kind of opposites, aren't they? But you see, nobody at this conference is asking any questions like this, because to ask any question is automatically to deny climate science and to go against the Communist Party line. And then what is interesting is that even in this 1 out of 54 papers that said there was detection and attribution of anthropogenic influences on extreme weather, even that paper was at one with the other 53 papers in finding that hurricanes, tropical cyclones, tornadoes, meteorological droughts, hydrological droughts, floods, thunderstorms, lightning, gales, and hail were not attributable to us at all. Now, this is Dr. Pielike looking at what IPCC actually said in its 2021 assessment report. So now let us go back to these heat waves, fire weather, severe droughts, and heavy rain, and let us see what the data, the real world data, rather than some model in an attribution study, actually found. Here then, heat waves in the United States, because Grinsted's paper of 2019, on which the IPCC founded its entire case for attribution, was a United States paper. It was about United States data. Here is the evidence. The heat waves in the United States were far worse in the Grapes of Wrath era in the 1930s. You've read John Steinbeck's novel, I dare say. Than today. There has been a steady downtrend since 1930 in heat waves in the United States, directly contrary to what Grinsted's model found. Now, the rule in silence, fellow delegates to COP26, your eminences, your holinesses, your pietisms, the rule is that if a model says one thing and the data says another, then there's something wrong with the model, and you go with the data. And the data show heat waves falling. So is Grinsted saying that the falling of heat waves is attributable to us? I guess not. But he should have been, because it has been falling. Heat-related deaths, therefore, have been tumbling. Here are the figures. Forest fires have been declining throughout the world, even as CO2 emissions rise. And that's a paper by Yang in 2017. Once again, I'm simply relying on published scientific papers. Here, the European Environment Agency, not admittedly a scientific source, a political source, but nevertheless, even they show that in the 5 Club Med countries, that's the yellow graph there, jiggling up and down, it's a general downtrend. All the other countries, not much trend at all in forest fires on this side of the Atlantic, any more than there is on the other side of the Atlantic. It isn't happening. Now, I visited Montana recently and was taken around the state and up into the mountains and into the forests by a county commissioner there. And he said to me that 2 communists, environmentalists, they use environmentalism as a cover, had come in from another state, and they had mounted an enormous campaign to prevent the scrub from under the trees from being cleared. He said the next time a forest fire gets going here, and he said I wouldn't put it past them actually to start one, it'll destroy most of Montana. And that, sadly, is what happened a few years later. Not because of global warming, but because environmentalists who wanted to blame forest fires on global warming had persuaded the rather slow administration there that it should not make proper fire breaks in the forests to prevent wholesale damage when forest fires occur. So then let's look at the droughts. The Palmer Drought Severity Index is the authoritative index of whether weather has been wetter or drier than average, and it's been kept up to 1900. It's been kept for more than a century. It shows no trend. But what about the more recent period when we might have influenced matters? Well, here it is, a 30-year downturn in droughts in Howe et al. 2014. Once again, a scientific paper. In fact, this is the most authoritative of all the scientific papers on the extent of land area of the globe under drought throughout the world. And it's a clear downtrend in droughts generally and a zero trend in the severe and exceptional droughts which Grinsted is trying to attribute, and so is the IPCC, to us. There is absolutely no evidence in the data for the conclusions that IPCC has come to on the matter of attributing extreme weather events to us. And finally, rainfall. Well, in this country, we know a thing or two about rainfall. Here in Scotland, there are 7 different words in Scots Gaelic for rain. And if you get a really heavy rainstorm, that is known as a helliver. So these 7 species of rain mean we know a lot about rain. Now, the British Wet Office, which keeps the records of rainfall in this country, has been doing so for 250 years this year. It is the longest rainfall record in the world. So let me now present to you the results of a perfectly straightforward least squares linear regression trend on the data from the Met Office. Here it is. Rainfall has increased by 1 inch over the past 250 years. And it would be a very brave scientist indeed, or a very politically partisan one, who would dare to try to say that that trivial change was anything other than attributable to natural variability. But let us look at some of the matters that weren't included in Dr. Pielike's list. Sea level change. And since we're in Europe, and we're recently in the European tyranny by Clark, though we have now broken free of that largely unelected supranational institution where all the powers lie in the hands of commissars who have the right at will to override the elected representatives' wishes in the European Parliament, sea level change has been insignificant. In fact, sea level, according to the Envisat satellite, which operated for 8 years, showed sea level rising not at 3.2 centimetres or 1¼ inches per year or per decade, but per century, about half the rate of the previous century, a negligible rate. So how are they getting away with reporting that sea level rise is getting faster? Well, it's very simple. They make it up. They introduce a factor called the glacial isostatic adjustment. Now, I do not think that this glacial isostatic adjustment is an appropriate adjustment. I don't think it's correctly calculated. In fact, I know it's not correctly calculated because the late Thomas Weissmuller, another very distinguished scientist whom I'm happy to quote and remember, did some very distinguished work to make allowance for tectonic displacements up and down all around the world. And he found that sea level is rising, but it's rising at a rate of 1.1 millimeters per year, about 4.5 inches per century equivalent. So this glacial isostatic adjustment is an adjustment which they make, and that is responsible for nearly all. In fact, in this particular period on the graph here, from Kazanav et al. In 2009, it's responsible for turning a fall in sea level to a rise in sea level. And that, my fellow delegates at COP26, is the data on the basis of which you are telling us it's 1 minute to midnight. Sea level predictions are falling. They've fallen in each of the last 4 IPCC reports because they kept on over-predicting it. If they hadn't over-predicted it at the outset, the scare would never have got going. But then they realized they couldn't go on maintaining those predictions because they were ludicrous. They didn't bear any relation to what was actually happening, so they've had to reduce them and reduce them and reduce them and reduce them. Global sea ice loss is so small, as monitored here by the University of Illinois, that I can no longer find the updated version of this graph. They seem to have stopped publishing it because it's too darn inconvenient. It shows neither the area nor the trend in global sea ice really varying very much at all, certainly not varying much in relation to the annual variations, which of course are quite large between summer and winter. Then there's ocean acidification. The ocean is not and will not be acid. In fact, at the moment, it's quite pronouncedly alkaline, which, delegates, in case you didn't know, is the opposite of acid. And it's going to remain alkaline because the measurements in the few places where they've been conducted show that the pH, that's the acid-base balance, is declining at only 0.2 points per century from about 0.8. So it's not going to get to acidity even in 100 or 200 years. But of course that doesn't stop them writing papers about it. When it first came on the horizon as part of the party line, everybody jumped in and wrote Me Too papers. And here you can see Greg Wrightstone, who published a very distinguished book on this, has published this data. Methane. You hear that, oh, it's 23 times more dangerous than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. Well, no, it isn't, fellow COP delegates. The answer is that first of all, its concentration is barely growing, as you can see here. Secondly, it's measured in parts per billion by volume. And thirdly, on entering the atmosphere, it very rapidly breaks down into CO2 and other more harmless agents, which therefore means it causes far, far less warming than IPCC would have us believe. And sure enough, they've had to revise downwards their growth in methane concentration over and over and over and over again since their earlier reports. Hurricane activity is at worst level and at best decreasing. And that is what one would expect. If the world gets warmer, the temperature differentials in the climate system become smaller, and it's those differentials above all else that drive tropical storms and hurricanes. And if we go back to the paleoclimate, you hear them banging on about how it's all far more extreme than anything we've seen before. Here again, what you see is a mismatch between CO2 concentration in purple on this graph, which reached a peak 750 million years ago. Most of you delegates are too young to remember. But it was 7,000 parts per million. 750 million years ago, now 400 parts per million. And no match between the two sets of temperature. Here is the late Robert Carter's favourite graph. It shows the temperature at the summit of the Greenland ice sheet over the last 8,000 years, declining steadily, while CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is increasing steadily. Not much correlation between those two then. And although correlation does not necessarily imply causation, in logic, absence of correlation, as you see definitively established here, is proof of absence of causation. Here are the annual climate-related deaths. And this is an updated version of the graph you saw earlier. And here you can see the 2020 figure. It can't fall very much further, now can it? That doesn't look to me like 1 minute to midnight. Does it, Mr. Prime Minister? Has nobody shown you any of this information? And then a curious error spotted by a very distinguished scientist, Pat Frank, at the Stanford Linear Accelerator. And he found that the equations that the models have to solve in each of 1 million cells, 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers by 1 kilometer in the atmosphere, there are 1 million of them. They have to do this calculation with these equations over and over and over and over again, over several hundred time steps, as they are called, so that the climate evolves from the starting point they specify to the future that they want to try to predict. Now, the problem with using a model that uses these equations is that these equations are not susceptible of a closed-form solution. And if you can find a closed-form solution, there's $1 million waiting for you at the Clay Mathematics Institute. But so far, nobody's managed to claim it. So these equations are difficult. They can only be solved what's called numerically, by plugging in values and calculating the output in a computer. Now, the problem with that technique is that you get any uncertainty in the data that you start off with in the first iteration will propagate throughout the model, and that large orange zone is the zone of uncertainty in just one of the thousands of variables that inform these models. And what it shows is that the propagation of that uncertainty means that you could get an uncertainty zone of plus or minus 12 Celsius degrees by 100 years' time. And that means that any predictions you make that are less than plus or minus 12 Celsius degrees in 100 years' time are, statistically speaking, proven beyond any shadow of a doubt to be no better than guesswork. So, delegates at COP26, your case for saying we're all doomed is based purely on what has been proven in Pat Frack's paper of 2019 to be guesswork. And in fact, I was at the World Federation of Scientists conference in Eritrea in Sicily in 2016. When Pat first presented his results, he was howled down in the most appalling fashion by the climate communist scientists there. They were so rude to him that he almost came off the stage in tears. And I went to comfort him and I said, you must publish this paper. He was rejected 9 times by a total of 30 reviewers, until eventually a journal sent it to Carl Wunsch. Now, Carl Wunsch is not a scientist on our side of the debate, but he is one of the very few on the other side of the debate who has a capacity for being honest. And when he saw Pat's paper, he realized at once that Pat was right. And he said, I don't like this result, but it is a true result, and it is to be published. And it was published. It is perhaps the most important paper ever to have been published in the history of climatology, because what it shows is that you cannot use climate models to tell us anything whatsoever about the future evolution of global temperature. Now then, there is an error found by my team, which I shall cover briefly, because it is so simple. Here is the data for the equilibrium state of the climate in 1850. It was an equilibrium because there would be no global warming from 1850 for another 80 years. It was a zero trend. The climate, therefore, was pretty much in equilibrium. And it is valuable for that reason. When I first wrote to Sir John Horton, the late Sir John Horton, who was then head of the IPCC, back in 2006-7, to say, how do you get from only 1 Celsius of direct warming by global CO2 emissions to 4 Celsius of final warming? He said, it's because of the data for 1850. Because what they said was that there was a natural greenhouse effect of 32 Kelvin, of which only 8 Kelvin roughly was directly forced warming from the greenhouse gases, the pre-industrial non-condensing naturally occurring greenhouse gases. Therefore, you multiply any direct warming from greenhouse gases by 4. But that was a mistake, because 97% of the direct temperature that prevailed in 1850 came from the sun, and therefore 97% of the feedback response that was evident in 1850 also came from the sun. Well, what then is feedback response? It is an additional warming dependent upon and proportional to the direct or reference temperature. At any moment, the feedback process is then present, must respond in strict and direct proportion to the magnitudes of the components in reference temperature. What that means in plain English is they forgot the sun was shining and that the sun was responsible for 97% of the feedback response that they were incorrectly adding to and miscounting as part of the feedback response to the greenhouse gases. And here you can see the contrast between their error and the correct position in 1850. 32 over 8, roughly, they reckoned 4.2 is what you had to multiply the direct warming from CO2 by to get the final warming. Actually, it's less than 1.1, provided you put the solar warming of 255 Kelvin at the top and bottom of that ratio. It's a really simple, really serious error. There it is in one slide. That's how bad the science behind this global warming drivel actually is. And the effect of their errors is to multiply the true rate of warming by about 4. But it gets worse, because if you use the correct way of attributing feedback, then you'll find that just a 1% increase in the feedback regime, in the system gain factor as it's called, would lead to a 250% increase in global mean surface temperature response. And that, once again, confirms Pat Frank's finding. It means there's absolutely no way that you can, in any way, make forecasts about how much global warming we're going to cause. And that means that they have to rely instead on the actual evolution of temperature as measured by our temperature sensors. So how did they make this mistake? They made it by relying upon the standard diagram for a feedback loop on the left. We have redone that with a functionally identical diagram on the right, in which it's much plainer that you have two inputs, both of which are amplified in proportion to their magnitudes by the feedback fraction at the bottom there. And those two inputs at the top left of the right-hand diagram are the base signal, that's the one from the sun, and the gain, that's the one from the greenhouse gases. That's the mistake they made. They didn't understand that these two graphs are functionally equivalent. And sure enough, because they make that mistake, they assume that there is no great change in the feedback response with temperature, and that therefore you will get about 4 Celsius of warming per 1 Celsius of direct warming on doubling of CO2. I say again, they forgot the sun was shining. So global warming then is not a strategic threat at all. The real threat is the sheer, overweening, unbelievable ignorance of elementary science, mathematics, and scientific method on the part, in particular, of the Western governing elites. We can no longer afford to have people so little qualified making such catastrophically expensive decisions designed to crush our working people and our economies in the West as business after business after business. The aluminium smelter at Kinloch-Leven, the steel works from almost everywhere in Britain, the coal mining industry, all these industries, one by one, transferred from here, and where to? To China, to India, to Russia, to countries that are not tying themselves down with this climate nonsense. And the purpose of this presentation today has been to show you, you delegates, that you need to look at the science just a little bit, rather than simply believing what you are told by those who have a political agenda profoundly inimical to the freedoms that we have until now enjoyed here in the Western world. So I say this finally to you in concluding this presentation, fellow delegates at COP26. I say this to you, Your Majesty. I say this to you, Your Royal Highness, you, Prime Minister, you, Mr. President. Wake up, Mr. Prime Minister. Wake up, Mr. President, and pay heed. Because you're all about saving the planet. Well, here's the thing. The planet was triumphantly saved 2,000 years ago, and it does not need to be saved again. Thank you.